I wanted to to make the point of just how important decarbonising transport is. So I want to start by just reminding us of the UK target for decarbonising our economy and the role that transport emissions play in that. To say a bit about how we can go about achieving reductions nationally, and then just say a bit about what we do at Aston University as an organisation which has a lot of staff and students who arrive every day by various means of transport. So let's just remind ourselves that the best scientific evidence suggests that we need to cut global emissions by about 50% by 2050 if we are to keep temperature rise to keep a reasonable probability that temperature rise will not be greatly above 2 degrees by the end of the century. So that means by 2050 we have to get global emissions down to something like 22 gigatons, and we have to keep on reducing them after that as well. We have to remember the challenge doesn't stop in 2050. But with 9 billion people, which is what the UN thinks we might have, that's 2.5 tons of CO2 per year each. 2.5 tons of CO2 per year each in 2050. And for us in the UK, based on the 1990 baseline we do all this against, that means we have to reduce our emissions by about 80%. So that's where our target for 2050 that's in the Climate Change Act comes from. It comes from the fact we get about 2.5 tons per head each in 2050 globally. So here's our 2008 emissions, and there with a shadow of Nigel's head on is our 2050 objective. We've got to get down from somewhere about 650 megatons to about less than 160 megatons. And you can see that power generation is the largest contributor, the yellow block at the bottom, but that domestic transport is the second largest contributor. So clearly we've got to reduce power generation, but domestic transport is absolutely critical. If we can't meet the target on that, we're not going to meet the target overall. And road transport is most of what domestic transport is. It's about 20% of UK emissions. We're lucky we're not in the US, where it's 33% of the country's emissions. And globally, we have about 1 billion vehicles. They already use more than half of all of the oil produced in the world. Woo. It's accelerating me through this, but that's probably no bad thing. And this one, for me, just helps me get a grip on what the scale of this thing is, that in 2050 we've got 2.5 tons per head each, and a pretty average car today, driven a pretty average distance, emits 2.5 tons. So you've got to fit your life into the emissions of your car. That's the scale of the challenge that people like me are leaving for the next generation. And in 2050, my undergraduates today will, I hope, be the leaders of industry and of universities and of NHS trusts and whatever. That's the challenge that I have to send them out prepared to deliver. The biggest part of that challenge is cars and vans. So light-duty vehicles make up 73% of our domestic transport emissions. And then rapidly growing is HGVs. So you're hearing about freight today as well, and that's a really critical part of the picture, especially as we go forward. The things that we think make towns and cities polluted, the buses, are actually a very small part of the picture, although it's still something we need to address. And rail at 2% is a very small part of the picture indeed. So not only are there more of us in the UK, the population is growing quite fast and we are buying more cars, or rather we have more cars, but we also drive further. So every year we drive further and further. It has dipped in the recession. You can just see the start of the recession on this graph, and you can see very clearly one of the previous recessions on this graph of distance travelled in the UK. But as we come out of the recession, that will come back up pretty much to this straight line if data from the 1950s onwards is anything to go by. So we drive even further every year, and one of the other things is we drive more and more in cities. And the problem with driving in cities is that driving in cities is twice as carbon intense as driving between cities. So the impact of congestion on the CO2 emissions from vehicles. The impact of stop-start, the impact of sitting with your engine running means that driving in cities, driving in congested areas is a very bad thing to do. So people spend a lot of time looking for parking spaces, and that contributes to this very high energy intensity of city driving. So we need to achieve very significant CO2 reductions. That needs to come through us behaving as efficient, carbon-efficient citizens, us living in carbon-efficient cities, and us, where we have to drive cars, driving carbon-efficient cars. So let me touch on each of those three areas. We spend a lot of time on the Committee on Climate Change, of which I'm the transport specialist, looking at what can we do at zero cost to reduce CO2 emissions and CO2 emissions from transport. So if we could persuade everybody to choose the most carbon-efficient vehicle in the class when they buy a new car, we could reduce emissions by 25 to 30%. If we could get everybody to be trained in and to use eco-driving, there might be 15%. If we could get everybody to stick to the motorway speed limit of 70 miles an hour, there's 10%. If we could reduce that speed limit to 60 miles an hour, there's 20% emissions saving. Reduce marginal car use, more use of public transport, reduce congestion. All of this comes pretty much for nothing. But of course, it's the behaviour change piece, and of course, it's something, unfortunately, we all know it's something that we all want somebody else to do, as our cartoon suggests. But just to kind of really emphasize that, here's the SMMT, the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders data for new car sales last year. And here are all the categories of car. And these boxes show where 50% of the car sales came. But the bottom of this line shows what the lowest emitting vehicle in that class was. And these ones, of course, now have electric vehicles, so zero emissions in use. But if we could, even if you ignore the electric ones, if we could just persuade all of these people to buy that vehicle, the lowest emitting vehicle in the class, there is a 25 to 30% reduction in CO2 emissions from those vehicles from technology and vehicles that are in the showrooms today. So we need to persuade people, we need to make sure people have the information and are encouraged to buy the lowest emitting vehicle in their class. Because if you need an MPV for your large family, we're not going to try and make you buy a Mini. You need to buy an MPV, but you can buy a lower emitting MPV than the one on average people are buying today. So in our path to 2020 and meeting our third carbon budget and the Committee on Climate Change, we assume that efficient behaviour of people delivers about a 22% reduction in transport emissions. Sadly, in a way, only 6% of that comes from improved driving behaviour and modal shift. So some reduced car use from things like smarter choices, some eco-driving, some hopefully sticking to the speed limit, but we don't actually include reducing it to 60 because we realise governments are very reluctant to do that kind of thing. But actually most of that benefit comes from reducing vehicle emissions because of an average new car target of legislated target of 95 grams of CO2 per kilometre in 2020. Now we know that target is being challenged in the European Union at the moment by the large car manufacturers, and one of the things that we will be arguing very strongly on the Committee on Climate Change is that it is essential for us to stick to that target. That is what's accelerating the new technology into vehicles in the showrooms today, and we really do need to set these targets and to meet them if we're going to deliver the transport emissions reductions that we can and we need to. We also need efficient cities. Efficient cities are ones where it's easy for people to get around by public transport, and there's a huge difference between the use of public transport in different kinds of cities. So a typical North American city like Calgary, most people travel by car. An Asian city like Hong Kong, most people don't travel by car. And here's the graph. This is the percentage of journeys taken by private vehicle. and this is the GDP per head, so let's be fair, and let's compare this line of the similar GDP per head, and we can see here's Hong Kong with less than 20%, here's London with about 50% by private car, and here's Calgary with that nearly 90% by private car. And of course, a lot of that's about public transport, and a lot of that's also about city design. And one of the things we need to avoid is this North American pattern of all of these wonderful little dispersed gated communities away from the city centre, which are too small to sustain decent, frequent public transport into the city centre, so everybody travels by car. So the kind of densification of which Hong Kong is a very extreme, Hong Kong is a very extreme example, that kind of city growth by compaction is a real benefit in terms of planning to reduce the travel emissions. However, just as a kind of note to say we can't do it all by getting people out of our cars, we need to realise that getting people out of their cars is difficult. And we all know that because I'm sure all of us find it difficult. But here's a really, really busy city, a really congested city, Delhi. And here's some research by the Indian Institute of Technology in Delhi showing what's the quickest way to get around Delhi. And here's a 3-kilometre trip, and here's the car. And here's the bicycle, and here's walking, and here's two forms of public transport. And their research suggested the car was quite a lot quicker for a very short trip. Here's the 6-kilometre trip, and the car is still quite a lot quicker than the bicycle or the public transport. And here's the 12-kilometre trip, and the car is about the same, but of course it's raining, and it's much more convenient, and you've got all that luggage, so you'll probably take the car. And here's the 24-kilometre trip, and you have to get to a 24-kilometre trip in that crowded city before you might really think the car is rather a slow way to get around, and public transport might be a better idea. Now, that isn't one of our cities, and we don't quite have Delhi's conditions, but actually that is, fundamentally that is one of the reasons why it's very hard to get people out of their cars in congested cities, because actually, even for short journeys, the car can be a very quick and convenient way of doing it. So we do also, as well as better public transport, as well as making people better citizens, we do also need better car technology. So, of course, you need carrots and sticks. You need to get people out of their cars, to get modal shift. You need really great public transport. And then you need, after you've given them great public transport, you can start to bring in some of the kinds of financial penalties that we know in London and other places have started to be effective. But that Delhi example reminds us we really do need very efficient cars, and we need people to buy them. Probably internal combustion engine technology can take us down to about 70 grams per kilometre, about half of where we are today. But actually by 2050, we've got to be down to something like 20 grams per kilometre. And that means we're going to need biofuels, hydrogen, electricity. We're probably going to need all of them. Biofuels is probably problematic because just the scale of road transport. 53% of oil produced in the world today is used by road transport. We probably can't do that in biofuels. So what we probably need is some combination of hydrogen and electric, and we probably need a lot of it by 2050. This shows you the effective vehicle emissions of both the vehicle and of the vehicle, including the production of the vehicle fuel. So it's a fair comparison between an electric vehicle and a petrol or diesel vehicle. And this, obviously, an electric vehicle varies with the carbon intensity of the electricity grid. So here's our current electricity grid intensity, and this red line is an electric vehicle, and that shows you that an electric vehicle is somewhere close to this green line, which is something like the latest Toyota Prius. So an electric vehicle today, even with today's electricity, is probably as good as a Toyota Prius in the UK. But by 2020, when our grid should be down to nearer 300 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, it will be considerably better than even the best internal combustion engine vehicle. And by 2030, when we hope to be down closer to 50 to 100 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, it will be way better than the Toyota Prius. Indeed, it'll be down at that 20 grams of CO2 per kilometre sort of range. It would be a bit higher if you had a hydrogen vehicle and you were making the hydrogen from grid electricity, but by the time you get to 2030, your hydrogen vehicle is looking very good as well. So we will need to encourage people to buy those new low emissions technologies. And this is the Committee on Climate Change. This is the kind of mix of new vehicles we need to see by 2030. Clearly, we're not trying to predict the future. The kind of mix we need to see will be something like 60% of really low carbon vehicles and no more than about 40% of highly efficient but conventional internal combustion engine vehicles. And that should give us something like 52 grams per kilometre as the new car CO2 versus actually last year we made it down to 130 grams per kilometre for the new car CO2. So that's the sort of scale of challenge for the next 16 or 17 years. So let me just finish by saying, what are we doing at my university? Well, in order to try to reduce the emissions, the travel emissions of our staff and students, we have a lot of work on education and awareness. And we've just appointed a Royal Academy of Engineering visiting professor of sustainable design who is getting very, very engaged with everything we do in the university, not just the syllabus for the students, but also how we behave as an institution. And he's very, very passionate about that. And he's working with our green team, with our environment team in the university. We are doing a lot to encourage modal shift to public transport. One of those is increasing our parking charges, which are salary related, but whilst increasing our parking charges, we're also reducing the amount of parking we have so that our staff don't think this is just a way for the university to make money out of them. Make it absolutely clear this is revenue neutral. This is about encouraging people to use other forms of transport. We have signed up for car share websites, although they haven't been very enthusiastically taken up. But we do have now a university app which will tell you live bus and train information, and we have made sure that all of the bus stops around the university are in brightly lit, sheltered places where it is actually pleasant to stand even on a dark winter's evening, so people don't feel uncomfortable or threatened about using public transport. We also have cars available on site which staff can take in an emergency if somebody rings up and says your child's fallen over at school. We're also encouraging cycling and walking, so we've made a lot of investment in cycle facilities, whether it's parking and locking, or whether it's changing and lockers for your clothes. We have a very active user group. We've got business cycle mileage for staff. We've got a cycle purchase scheme out of gross salary, etc., etc., etc. And we're also encouraging the purchase of low emissions vehicles. We have an electric car in the university that staff can use. We have a staff benefit whereby you can lease a low emissions vehicle out of gross salary. We have charging points now in our car parks, and we're again looking at the introduction of emissions-based charging for car parking spaces. And just to prove it, we're actually on our second electric vehicle. This was our first one that was delivered about 4 years ago, and that's now been replaced by one with some better battery technology in it, which is going very well. So the big question is, has it made a difference? And I'm very pleased to say that it has. We've so far had 3 travel surveys. We're about to do our 4th, so we're about to get the next data point. But we have reduced driving to work from something like 56% to about 37%. Use of the train has increased. Use of the bus has increased. We've doubled the number of people cycling and walking. And if somebody can tell me what are the other ways people get to work on this survey, I'd really like to know, because I'm extremely intrigued, because we've also doubled those. So whatever they are, it's good to see them increasing if they don't emit too many CO2 emissions. So really the message is there is a lot we can do as organisations. It really is worth trying. Our staff have responded extremely well. Our challenge, of course, in the first couple of years we saw a huge improvement. We've seen a slower improvement. Our challenge is what are the new initiatives that can help us to keep on moving this downwards. So thank you very much for listening, and good luck with your own activities to try and achieve the same. Thank you.